He built a billion-dollar empire without ever looking back, until one evening, he saw 3 boys washing his office windows, and realized they looked exactly like him. Nicholas Rains had never walked home before. Not really. On most days, his driver waited at the side entrance of his glass-walled empire with the engine running, the back seat heated, and an itinerary already displayed on the screen. But that evening, something pulled him to the sidewalk. Maybe it was the stress of the day, relentless meetings, tense investor calls, and a legal battle he was too tired to pretend to care about anymore. Or maybe it was the strange ache in his chest he hadn't been able to name for weeks. The streets around his downtown tower were still humming with life, but for once, Nicholas didn't look down at his phone. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, letting the cold air bite at his face. It was the kind of quiet he usually avoided. When he reached the far side of his building, a flash of movement on the other side of the glass caught his eye. He paused. There, balancing awkwardly on a makeshift scaffold outside the second-story windows, were 3 small figures in identical jackets and wool caps. They moved quickly, one wiping a streaked pane while the other 2 held a bottle of cleaner and a bucket of water that sloshed with each shift in weight. He almost kept walking, until one of the boys turned his head toward the street, and the light from the lamp post hit his face. Nicholas stopped cold. The boy had his eyes. Not just the same color, but the same shape, the same sharpness in the corners when he squinted. Then the second boy looked down. Same chin. Same crooked little smile. The third dropped a rag, and as he climbed down to retrieve it, Nicholas caught a full glimpse of him, and it was like looking at a mirror from another lifetime. He didn't move. For a long moment, he simply stood there, locked in place, his brain scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. 3 boys, no older than 6, working together with practiced efficiency, washing windows they had no business reaching, wearing clothes too thin for the season. But it wasn't the labor that stunned him. It was their faces. They looked like him. Not in a vague, familiar way. Not in a coincidence you could explain away. These boys had his jawline, his dimples, his deep blue eyes. They had the same way of tilting their heads, the same restless movement in their hands. He didn't know them, had never seen them before, but his entire body reacted to the sight of them like it recognized something ancient and buried. He stepped closer. "Hey," he called out. "Where are your parents?" One of the boys, the tallest of the 3, turned to him with narrowed eyes and answered without hesitation. "We don't have any." His voice was steady. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask for help. He simply said it like it was a fact that didn't need sympathy. Nicholas hesitated. "How old are you?" "6, said the smallest, who had climbed back up with the rag. "Do you work here?" "We clean. People pay sometimes." Nicholas ran a hand down his face. This was not a prank. Not a dream. These kids were real, and they were out here alone, washing windows of a building that bore his name. "Do you know who owns this building?" he asked, already sure of the answer. "No," the tallest said, shrugging. "Doesn't matter. We clean the outside." Nicholas stood there, suddenly unsure of what to do next. He had closed international deals in less time than this conversation had already taken. He could buy out companies with a signature. But in that moment, standing in front of 3 children who looked like his younger reflection cut into pieces and multiplied, he didn't know what came next. All he knew was that walking away wasn't an option. Nicholas didn't sleep that night. After the boys disappeared into the dark with their buckets and rags slung over their shoulders like it was the most normal thing in the world, he stood alone in front of the glass tower bearing his name and felt something he couldn't define, an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a crack forming somewhere in the armor he had spent years building. He had asked them a few more questions before they left, but the answers were brief, guarded. They said they stayed nearby, that they worked where people didn't yell, and that their mom used to help them before she got too sick to get up. That was all. Then they thanked him for the sandwich he offered and walked off down the street as if he were just another man who wouldn't follow. And he hadn't. Not then. He had let them go because he didn't know what else to do. But the next morning, his first call wasn't to his assistant. It wasn't to legal or finance or anyone waiting on him to finalize an acquisition. It was to a private investigator he had used before, someone discreet and fast. He gave them a description, rough ages, no names. Just 3 6-year-old boys with matching faces and no adults around, last seen washing windows after dark. He didn't explain why he needed the information. He just said it was urgent. While he waited, Nicholas tried to focus. He sat through a video call with his board and nodded at all the right times. He approved a budget proposal he hadn't read. But the entire time, their faces floated just behind his thoughts, like a memory he hadn't earned. By noon, he had results. Their names were Leo, Lucas, and Logan Sloan. 6 years old. Triplets. No father listed on the birth certificates. Mother, Hannah Sloan. The name hit him like a punch to the ribs. He hadn't heard it in years. Hannah had been the only woman he had ever truly allowed past the gates of his carefully structured life. She had been warm, steady, patient in ways that disarmed him. They had dated for 2 years when he was still rising through the tech world, before his name was printed in magazines and whispered in investment rooms. She had never asked for more than he could give, never demanded space he wasn't ready to share. But one day, she was gone. No goodbye. No note. Just silence. He had searched at first, called, checked hospitals and airports, but nothing. And eventually, like he did with most things he couldn't control, he buried it and moved forward. Now her name had resurfaced. And it came with 3 little boys who looked just like him. He closed the office door and sat down, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He requested everything the investigator could find, school records, hospital files, anything that might explain how Hannah had disappeared from his life only to reappear in the form of children he hadn't known existed. The next email arrived less than an hour later. Hannah had passed away 6 months ago from leukemia. She had no next of kin, no will, only a single contact listed for emergencies, a woman named Margaret, who volunteered at a community shelter and had been watching over the boys ever since. Nicholas stared at the file, his heart pounding. His sons. His actual sons. 6 years old. Living in a shelter. Cleaning windows at night. With no idea who he was. With no idea that he had been alive, working just floors above them. He got up and left the office without a word. He drove himself across the city, barely stopping for lights. The shelter was small and worn, tucked between a laundromat and an empty lot. Inside, Margaret was sitting behind a desk, knitting something pale blue. When he introduced himself, her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to quiet grief. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said. Nicholas didn't know what to say. He stood stiffly, as if someone might accuse him of being too late. "She left something for you," Margaret added, rising slowly. "A letter. She didn't know if you'd ever find them. But she hoped." She handed him a sealed envelope with his name written in Hannah's familiar handwriting. Nicholas didn't open it. Not yet. He couldn't. He tucked it into his coat pocket and asked the only question he could form. "Where are they now?" Margaret nodded toward the back. "School, for now. But they'll be back this afternoon." Nicholas looked around at the small space, the chipped paint, the shelves of donated clothes, and felt the weight of everything he had missed. He sat down to wait. Nicholas didn't move from the chair in the corner of the shelter for almost an hour. He didn't pace, didn't check his phone, didn't reach for the envelope in his pocket even though it felt like it was burning through the fabric. His hands were clasped tightly together, resting on his knee, as if keeping still could somehow hold back the flood of thoughts unraveling in his head. He had spent years controlling every variable, mastering every detail of his life and business. But this was chaos he had never accounted for. Not one son, but three. Not a scandal, not an accident, but a truth that had been breathing only miles from his office while he stared through glass windows at nothing. When the door creaked open and the boys entered with backpacks slung over their small shoulders and dirt on their shoes, Nicholas stood before he had time to think. They didn't see him right away. They were too busy arguing over who had won some race on the way back from school. Their laughter echoed through the front room, bright and careless, and for a second he froze, overwhelmed by how alive they were. It was Lucas who saw him first. He stopped mid-sentence, eyes locking with Nicholas's in a long, uncertain stare. The other two followed his gaze, and suddenly all three boys were standing in a line like soldiers unsure of what kind of man stood before them. Margaret stepped in gently. "Boys, this is Mr. Raines," she said quietly. "He's a friend of your mother's." Nicholas swallowed, forcing the words out. "Hi. I met you the other night outside my office building. He paused, unsure how to phrase what needed to be said without overwhelming them. "I knew your mom. A long time ago." Leo, the most outspoken, tilted his head slightly. "You were the guy with the sandwich." Nicholas nodded. "Yeah. That was me." They didn't rush toward him. They didn't smile or frown. They simply studied him, as if they could feel that something about him was important but hadn't decided yet whether he deserved their trust. The room was heavy with unspoken truths, and for the first time in his life, Nicholas didn't try to control the moment. He just lowered himself to their level and said quietly, "I think there's a lot I need to explain. And I'd like to do it right, if that's okay with you." Lucas crossed his arms. "Why now?" It wasn't rude. It was honest. Nicholas appreciated that more than he could say. He exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't know. I didn't know about you. And I should have." The boys exchanged glances, the kind that only siblings who knew each other's thoughts could share. It was Leo who finally said, "You look like us." Nicholas smiled for the first time in days. "I noticed that too." They agreed to sit with him for a little while. Margaret brought them cocoa, and Nicholas stayed quiet at first, letting the boys lead. They told him about their favorite teacher, about a neighborhood cat they weren't supposed to feed but did anyway, about how they used to watch their mom paint while she was still strong enough to hold a brush. The moment they said her name, everything inside Nicholas constricted. He reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. "I haven't read this yet," he said softly. "It's from your mom. She left it for me. Would you mind if I opened it now?" They were quiet, but none of them said no. Nicholas unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was instantly familiar, curved, elegant, with little loops at the bottom of certain letters. As he began to read, his throat tightened. "Nicholas. If you're reading this, then the boys have somehow found their way to you. Or maybe you found your way to them. I always believed you would, eventually. I didn't tell you because I was afraid, not of you, but of what your world might do to them. You were always reaching for something greater, and I didn't want to be the one to pull you down. I thought I could raise them alone. And I did, until I couldn't. They're smart. Brave. So much like you. Please don't walk away. Not this time. Hannah." He folded the letter slowly, pressing his hand to his chest as if it might keep his heart from falling apart. The boys didn't ask what it said. Somehow, they didn't need to. Nicholas looked at them and said, "Your mom was right. You are brave. And smart. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there sooner." For a moment, none of them moved. Then Logan, the quietest of the three, climbed onto the couch beside him and leaned into his arm, not saying a word. The other two followed, not hugging, not crying, just sitting close. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it was a beginning. One Nicholas never saw coming. One he knew he would never walk away from again. Nicholas spent the following week in unfamiliar territory. Each morning, instead of heading directly to his office, he drove to the shelter. At first, he came armed with things: new clothes, proper school supplies, meals delivered from restaurants he knew were clean and organic. It was his instinct, the only way he'd ever learned to show care, to provide, to fix, to give until there were no problems left to solve. But the boys weren't interested in perfection. They didn't care if the backpacks had logos or the meals had microgreens. They cared if he sat down while they ate, if he listened when they argued about superheroes, if he remembered who liked ketchup and who didn't. Nicholas realized that these small details, so easy to overlook, were what truly mattered. Leo challenged him the most. He asked blunt questions, always the first to say what the others were thinking but too unsure to ask. He wanted to know why Nicholas had never tried to find them before, why he hadn't known about Hannah being sick, why he didn't even send a birthday card. Nicholas didn't have clean answers. He told the truth, that he hadn't known. That he would have done everything differently if he had. That he was sorry. Not the rehearsed kind of sorry, but the aching, hollow kind that filled his chest like something heavy and overdue. Lucas was more curious than skeptical. He asked about Nicholas's work, his car, his apartment. He wanted to understand who this man was that looked like them and smelled faintly like expensive soap and coffee. He tested boundaries with questions and silly jokes, and Nicholas played along, slowly learning how to engage in a world that didn't require spreadsheets or financial forecasts. Logan said almost nothing for days. He watched. Always watching. When the others talked, he sat quietly with his hands folded, eyes drifting between them and Nicholas like he was collecting data no one else could see. It was Logan who surprised Nicholas the most. On the fourth day, when Nicholas arrived a little late, Logan walked up and placed a sticker on his lapel, a wrinkled, half-peeled superhero. He didn't explain. Just pressed it there and walked away. Nicholas didn't remove it, not even for his meeting later that afternoon. It stayed on his jacket like a badge of something far more important than approval, early trust. He began the formal process of gaining custody, but it wasn't simple. Hannah had left no legal will, and Nicholas's name wasn't on the birth certificates. Even with DNA testing, he had to prove emotional intent and show stability in an environment that would meet the boy's needs. It didn't help that every article online still painted him as an untouchable billionaire, a man known for profits, not parenting. The caseworker assigned to them was cautious, if not outright doubtful. She met with Nicholas twice and asked hard questions about his lifestyle, his availability, and his history with the boys. When she asked why he thought he could be their father now, Nicholas didn't speak about money or homes or future schooling. He said, "Because I see them. And I know now that nothing else I've built in my life matters if I lose this chance." Margaret stood by him throughout it all. She had watched the boys since the moment Hannah grew too weak to get out of bed. She had bathed them, read to them, answered impossible questions with a calm heart. When she spoke to the caseworker, she said, "He's not perfect. But he shows up. And I've learned, that's where fatherhood begins." There were setbacks. Delays. Requests for additional background checks and more court hearings. But Nicholas didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he had no exit strategy. He stayed through the noise, through the paperwork, through the restless nights of waiting for someone else to decide if he deserved to be the father he was already becoming. Each day, he grew more present. He learned how to braid Leo's hair when he insisted it grow out like a cartoon character. He figured out Lucas liked to fall asleep listening to science podcasts. He discovered Logan hated thunderstorms unless someone was there to count between lightning and thunder with him. Nicholas started answering emails less. He stopped checking stock prices first thing in the morning. He traded business calls for bedtime routines. And slowly, in the quiet of late afternoons filled with homework and spilled juice and laughter too loud for a man who once hated noise, Nicholas realized that he was not just repairing something broken, he was building something entirely new. Something that mattered more than power ever had. Something real. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything started to unravel. Nicholas had promised the boys he'd pick them up from school himself that day. It wasn't a big deal, not in the grand scope of his corporate life, but to them, it meant everything. Leo had even asked if they could stop for ice cream afterward, and Nicholas, still learning how to say yes to small, joyful things, had agreed without hesitation. But then came the call. One of the company's senior partners had made a miscalculation in a major international contract, and now $1 billion deal with a foreign investor was on the line. The legal team was already scrambling, the board was in chaos, and his assistant was pleading with him to come in immediately. Nicholas hesitated for less than 5 seconds before telling the driver to change course. He told himself he would only be gone for 20 minutes. 30 at most. It wasn't 30 minutes. It was 3 hours. By the time he made it to the school, the sun was setting, and the boys were gone. A teacher informed him that they'd waited outside for nearly an hour before someone from the shelter was contacted to come get them. She tried to sound neutral, but Nicholas could hear the disappointment behind her calm tone. He thanked her and left quickly, his chest tight. He didn't go back to the office. He didn't answer any more calls. Instead, he drove straight to the shelter, already preparing 1,000 apologies in his head. But the boys weren't there. Margaret looked at him with concern as she explained that when the volunteer arrived at the school, only Lucas had been waiting. The other two had wandered off, Leo insisting that, if their dad didn't care enough to show up, they'd find somewhere else to go. It hit Nicholas harder than he expected. Not just the fact that he had failed, but the way they had responded. Like it wasn't surprising. Like they had always expected him to leave eventually. They found them late that night, at the old apartment where they used to live with Hannah. The building was mostly condemned now, but the boys had snuck inside anyway. They had blankets, a flashlight, and a bag of snacks. When Nicholas arrived, they didn't cry or yell. Leo just looked at him and said, "Told you. We shouldn't have trusted him." Nicholas didn't try to defend himself. He didn't talk about emergencies or responsibilities or last-minute disasters. He sat down on the dusty floor, still in his designer suit, and said, "I messed up. I made the wrong choice today. And I hate that it made you feel like you don't matter, because you do. More than anything else." The boys didn't speak right away. Lucas leaned against his side quietly, still tired from the long day. Logan stared at the flashlight like it held answers he hadn't found in Nicholas's words. And Leo sat across from him, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "I don't need you to be perfect," Leo said finally. "But I need you to be there. Even when it's not convenient." Nicholas nodded. "I want to be. I will be. No matter what it costs." He took them home that night, not to the shelter, but to his place. He made them grilled cheese, the only thing he could cook without supervision. They ate on the floor in front of the TV, wrapped in blankets, not speaking much, but not walking away either. When they finally fell asleep, Nicholas stood in the hallway for a long time, watching their small bodies breathing in unison. He knew then that this wasn't about custody hearings or proving stability to the court. This was about showing up in the moments that couldn't be planned or rescheduled. The next morning, he called an emergency board meeting. His assistant tried to talk him out of it, but he was resolute. He stood in front of a room full of people in tailored suits and said he was stepping back. Not stepping down, not walking away from the empire he'd built, but stepping back. He would no longer sacrifice the people he loved for the company that had already taken enough of his life. The board was stunned. Some were angry. Others confused. But Nicholas didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he wasn't making decisions based on shareholders or profits. He was making them based on 3 little boys who had once stood outside his building and looked like his reflection. He went home that day earlier than usual, just in time to pick the boys up from school. He was 20 minutes early. Everything after that night began to shift in ways Nicholas hadn't expected. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no movie-like montages of sudden fatherhood perfection. But the change was real, slow, and rooted in the ordinary, messy rhythm of daily life. He started waking up before the boys, not because he had a meeting, but because he wanted to be the one who made breakfast. It was always something simple: scrambled eggs that were often overcooked, pancakes with uneven edges, toast that sometimes got a little too dark, but the boys didn't care. They showed up at the table in mismatched pajamas, hair messy, eyes still half closed, and they ate like it was a feast. Sometimes they even laughed. He set aside 2 days a week where he refused all work calls. His team learned quickly that unless the building was literally on fire, they weren't to disturb him. On those days, he picked the boys up from school himself, waited outside the gates just like every other parent, trying to look casual even though he often felt like an imposter. But when the boys saw him, when they ran toward him shouting, "Dad," like it was the most natural word in the world, all of that discomfort vanished. Those moments rewired something deep inside him. At night, they developed a new routine. Bath time was chaos, filled with arguments over who got the blue towel and who used all the shampoo. Afterward, they curled up on the big couch under one blanket while Nicholas read aloud, mostly fantasy books with dragons and portals and brave kids who saved the world. Sometimes they interrupted every 2 pages to ask questions or make up their own endings. Sometimes they just listened, their heads leaning against his arms until they started to drift off, one by one. He stayed awake long after they fell asleep, just sitting there, letting the silence fill the space in a way that felt warm instead of empty. He enrolled them in activities: art classes for Lucas, because he was always doodling, soccer for Leo, who couldn't sit still for more than 10 minutes, and music lessons for Logan, who never talked much but had perfect rhythm with his hands. Nicholas went to every single recital, every game, every open house. He didn't care how many meetings he had to reschedule. Every time he showed up and saw their faces light up just from knowing he was there, it reminded him why he was doing this at all. There were hard moments too. Days when Logan shut down and refused to speak to anyone. Nights when Lucas had nightmares and couldn't fall back asleep without lying across Nicholas's chest. Mornings when Leo snapped at him for no reason, then cried alone in the bathroom afterward. Each time, Nicholas stayed. He didn't try to fix it with money or solutions. He sat with them. He asked questions. He learned when to wait and when to hold on tighter. One evening, after all 3 had gone to bed, he found himself standing outside on the back porch of their rented house. He stared at the stars and thought of Hannah. He wondered if she had felt this same weight, this combination of fierce love and terrifying responsibility. He thought about the letter she'd written and how she had trusted him, even from a distance. He hoped, in some way, she could see them now. That she knew her boys were safe. Loved. That she'd given him more than children, she'd given him purpose. He made a decision that night. Something permanent. Something real. He called his lawyer the next morning and started the paperwork to legally adopt all 3 boys. They were already his in every way that mattered, but he wanted them to know, with certainty, that they would never be left behind again. He didn't tell them right away. He waited until the forms were approved, until the day they could walk into court together, and a judge could say what Nicholas already felt with every fiber of his being, that they were his sons. When that day came, he stood in a room filled with strangers and looked down at the 3 boys holding his hands, wearing small suits and nervous smiles, and he realized he had never felt more certain about anything in his entire life. When the judge asked if he understood the responsibility, if he accepted them as his children not just in name but in heart, Nicholas answered without hesitation. "I already do." The adoption changed everything, and at the same time, changed nothing at all. There was no grand shift in their daily life, no dramatic alteration in the way they spoke or behaved around each other, but something unspoken had solidified. The boys began to relax in new ways. The tension that sometimes lingered beneath their laughter started to dissolve. They no longer glanced sideways when Nicholas was late coming home or hesitated to call out, "Dad," like it might still disappear if said too loud. It was theirs now. That word belonged to them as much as it belonged to him, and none of them questioned it anymore. Nicholas, for his part, felt a new kind of responsibility settle in his chest. It wasn't the weight of financial risk or corporate decision-making. This was something deeper, rooted not in pressure but in devotion. He began to think ahead in terms of their lives instead of earnings. He stopped imagining success in terms of quarterly growth and started picturing school plays, scraped knees, broken science projects and questions about girls. He knew the hard parts weren't over. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to be there for every one of them, good and bad. They moved into a house outside the city soon after. Nothing massive, nothing ostentatious. Just a two-story place with a big backyard, a wraparound porch, and a dog they adopted together after much pleading from all three boys. The neighborhood was quiet and filled with the kinds of families Nicholas used to think he'd never understand. Now, he waved at neighbors and helped coach Leo's soccer team on weekends, even though he still didn't know all the rules. Weekends became sacred. Saturdays were for pancakes and cartoons and lazy afternoons with books and board games spread out across the living room floor. Sundays meant walks through the woods near their home, Logan collecting rocks in his backpack and Lucas trying to name birds they passed. Nicholas no longer woke with a sense of dread on Monday mornings. Even the chaos of school drop-offs and mismatched socks couldn't touch the peace he felt now. He started keeping a journal, something he hadn't done since he was in college. Not for business strategies or future goals, but for thoughts he didn't want to lose. Things the boys said. Questions they asked. The way Logan leaned into him without thinking when they watched a movie. The way Leo snorted when he laughed too hard. The way Lucas always made sure everyone else had a fork before he started eating. These were the kinds of things Nicholas wanted to remember. These were the moments he feared he had missed too many of already. One evening, Leo asked where their mom had gone when she died. Nicholas hesitated, not because he didn't know how to answer, but because he wanted to answer in a way that made sense to a 6-year-old's heart. He took them all outside, laid down on the grass with them, and pointed to the stars. "I don't know exactly," he said quietly. "But I think she's out there somewhere. Watching you. Proud of you. Loving you. Just from a little farther away." Lucas whispered, "Do you think she sees us now?" "I do," Nicholas said. "I think she never stops." They lay there in silence, for shadows beneath the night sky, and Nicholas thought about how strange life was. How something as massive as grief could soften into a kind of presence. How something as unexpected as fatherhood could become the most natural role he had ever stepped into. Later that night, Logan left a small note on Nicholas's nightstand in handwriting that was still shaky and uneven. It said, "Thank you for choosing us." Nicholas stared at it for a long time, his throat tight, his heart steady. He didn't need anything else in that moment, not praise, not success, not headlines or applause. Just that sentence. Just that tiny truth folded into a scrap of paper, reminding him of everything that mattered. Summer arrived like a quiet promise. The trees that lined their street bloomed in full, the backyard filled with the buzz of bees and the rustle of wind through green leaves, and the boys spent every possible moment outside, barefoot in the grass, soaked with sprinkler water and laughter. Nicholas had never loved a season before. He had never really noticed one. Before them, years passed like board meetings, efficiently, without color, without pause. But now he counted the time by the freckles on their noses, the height marks on the kitchen wall, the way Lucas started reading chapter books without help and Logan could tie his own shoes without asking. Even Leo, who had once crossed his arms and said he didn't trust anyone with a suit, now asked Nicholas to help build forts out of old sheets and couch cushions, just because he liked how they did it together. They didn't talk about court dates anymore. They didn't need to. The adoption was finalized, the papers sealed, the new birth certificates filed, but the truth of it had already settled long before the judge's signature. They were family. Real. Untouched by doubt. And now that their lives weren't balanced on uncertainty, Nicholas focused on building something more than safety. He wanted to build joy. They took their first real vacation in July, driving upstate to a cabin by a lake that had no internet, no reception, and no distractions. The boys were skeptical at first. No games, no cartoons, no delivery pizza. But within a day, they were hunting for frogs, catching fireflies in jars, and falling asleep under wool blankets with their hair smelling like smoke from the campfire. Nicholas cooked every meal with them. He helped them carve their names into the wood railing of the porch, and though he never admitted it, he cried a little when he saw "Dad" written next to their initials. It was messy and crooked and etched with a stick, but it meant more than any building he'd ever owned. One night, the sky broke open with stars, clearer than anything they could see in the city, and the four of them sat on the dock in silence, their feet dangling above the dark water. Leo asked if people really became stars when they died. Nicholas didn't have a perfect answer, but he said, "If anyone did, your mom probably got the brightest one." Logan pointed to the sky and picked one at random, then whispered, "Hi, Mom," like it was a secret he didn't want anyone else to hear. Nicholas put his arm around them both and just stayed there, letting the quiet stretch out. When they returned home, they planted a tree in the backyard, a cherry blossom, soft pink and wild. Lucas came up with the idea, saying it could be their way of remembering Hannah. Nicholas helped them dig, even when the ground fought back, and when the tree stood upright and the soil was packed, he felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't closure. It was continuation. A living thing to remind them that life didn't just end. It grew in new directions. School resumed. Schedules returned. But now everything felt different. Nicholas didn't dread early mornings or the chaos of 3 backpacks and forgotten lunchboxes. He liked the mess, the noise, the imperfection of their little universe. His home, once a quiet place full of sharp lines and silence, was now covered in crayon drawings and soccer cleats and half-finished science experiments on the kitchen counter. And he had never felt prouder of anything. On a random Wednesday night, while they were eating spaghetti and arguing over who got more meatballs, Nicholas stopped and just watched them. No one noticed at first. They were too busy laughing, teasing each other, talking with their mouths full. But Lucas caught his eye eventually and asked, "What?" Nicholas shook his head slowly. "Nothing. I didn't know life could be like this." Leo leaned over with a mischievous grin. "You mean messy and loud and awesome?" Nicholas nodded. "Exactly that." That night, after everyone was asleep, he stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea and looked up at the same sky they had seen at the lake. Somewhere above, beyond what his eyes could trace, he hoped Hannah saw them. He hoped she knew that he had kept his promise, even if he hadn't made it out loud. He hadn't walked away. He had stayed. Not perfectly. Not without mistakes. But completely. He took out his phone, opened the Notes app where he kept quotes and reminders, and typed a single sentence. "This is the legacy I want, 3 boys who never have to wonder if they're loved." He put the phone down, took a deep breath of the summer air, and went back inside. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas Rains didn't feel like he was missing anything. From a storytelling perspective, the ending of this story felt not only satisfying but necessary. It began with a man who seemingly had everything, wealth, power, reputation, but lacked the one thing he didn't even know he was missing, connection. Watching Nicholas transform from a distant, high-functioning executive into a present, emotionally grounded father wasn't just heartwarming, it was a reminder that true legacy isn't built in boardrooms or on skyscraper walls, it's built in bedtime stories, in burnt toast breakfasts, and in promises kept when no one else is looking. The boys didn't just find a father, they helped a man become human again. And that is the kind of ending that stays with you. Quiet, real, and full of life.